Hi, welcome everyone to this talk on Down syndrome and physical development. My name is Stephanie Wheen and I am a paediatric physiotherapist. I'm also the CEO of Gympanzees, and I have had a interest in Down syndrome for many years. My brother has Down syndrome. He's now 27 years old, so it's been a long journey with him, a great journey. And I also worked for a charity in London for a day and a half a week for 2 years, just working with children with Down syndrome with a speech therapist and an occupational therapist. So I learned loads from them, and I kind of just wanted to share some of that with you today. In terms of physical development, we know that children with Down syndrome are going to walk, and the kind of normal spectrum of that is somewhere between 18 months and 5 years old, and that's if you don't have kind of very many complex other health conditions or other disabilities which can delay that further. And the discrepancy can be for loads of reasons. Can be because of their physical makeup, can be because of their learning difficulty, it can actually be just personality. You have a child who is fearless, even if their physical makeup isn't brilliant. If they launch themselves at everything, then they're probably going to get stronger and probably going to develop quicker than someone who has a better physical makeup but actually really just enjoys taking things in, and is a kind of a calmer personality. So it's not a massive benefit to be walking really early. Actually, for a lot of these children, because of their physical makeup, walking early isn't necessarily particularly useful for them. And there's nothing to show that if they walk early, that they develop better when they're older. So it's just a matter actually of building the right building blocks. If we get the right foundations, then we'll be able to get better skills as they get older. If we narrow their foundations, if we only give them a few skills, or if they compensate with kind of poor postures or poor ways of moving, then actually when we try to do jumping and playing sport and things like that, it'll be much harder. So from my point of view, it's all about quality rather than quantity. And there are three kind of main reasons why development can be delayed and things that we can think about and work on. So one is their physical kind of makeup, so hypotonia, which is low tone, and hypermobility, which is flexible joints. Second is their learning difficulties that are very specific to children with Down syndrome. And the third is their sensory integration. So that's how they're feeling the world and how they react to it. So we'll go through all of these. So first is hypotonia, which is low tone. So tone refers to the tension in your muscle when you try to move a joint. So if you were to take my arm and try and move it, without me trying to help you, but without me trying to work against you, there is some tension there. So it's not totally stiff and it's not totally floppy. And this is controlled by the brain. So there are signals coming from the brain into the muscle telling it to work hard or telling it not to work hard. And with low tone, there's less resistance, so it feels more floppy. Muscle strength is something very different from muscle tone. So muscle strength is basically the number of muscle fibers you have in a muscle that can pull and actually do the action. So when we are born, our muscles are all about the same size, and as we do work, we get these tiny little tears within the muscle, and new muscle comes in and fills in the gaps, or mends the gaps. So you just get more fibers coming in and more fibers coming in until you get a bigger and bigger muscle. And the bigger your muscle, the stronger you are. There are more muscle fibers that can pull, which means that you'll have more strength. So that is a very different thing from your brain telling your muscle how hard to work day to day. So you can have really big muscles, really strong muscles, but have low tone. So that's what we're hoping for with our children. Or it can be the other way around. You can have very tight muscles, high tone, and be really, really weak. So tone doesn't really change. There are things that we can do to influence it that we'll talk about in a bit. But it will basically stay fairly stable through your life, apart from actually children with Down syndrome. It's about the only condition where tone can get a little bit better. But generally you can't do as much about it as you can with strength. Strength we can work on. If you work on strength, you'll just get stronger and stronger and stronger. So that's what we want to focus on, really. And every child with Down syndrome will have a different level of hypomobility, hypotonia. So they may be really, really, really floppy, or they may just be mildly floppy, or very close to what regular tone feels like. And during the day that will go up and down. We'll talk about that again. The other thing that this leads to, I don't know whether you noticed when your children were babies, that actually they probably took up their entire surface. So if the floor's under here, they probably were a bit like that. Whereas if you have children when they're newborn, generally they're a little bit more squished up. And then if you pull at their legs, they kind of spring back. Now, if you're starting in this very long position, this very stretched out position, it's actually anything out here or anything in here is where we're at our weakest. We're strongest when we're in the middle here. And that's because, so each joint has two muscles that work around it. So this one here will pull to make it shorter, and this one here will lengthen, and that's how you get this movement. But the two of them work together. So it's not one working and the other switches off, it's both of them working together. So if this one and this one, if both of them are low tone, it's going to kind of flop from one end to the other like this. But if you think about, that's the one that's getting shorter, that's the one that's getting longer. If they're right at the end, then this one's has had a lot of stretch and it's very difficult for that one to move, whereas this one's really, really, really small. So they're doing very opposite things, so it's quite difficult for them to work against each other. Whereas in the middle, they're both at the same length and they can both work together, and you kind of get double the amount of strength, basically. So it means for our children, if they've started off in this really stretched out position, it's harder for them to do all their activities, even from a baby. It's harder for them to bring their hands together. It's harder for them to bring their hands to their face. It's harder for them to touch their toes. And all of this kind of being out like that stretches out the tummy, which means it's also harder for them to get their tummy working, which means that if their tummy is not working from the start, then their core stability, so which is the balance between the front and the back, is going to be harder. It's going to be harder for that to work really well. So what does low tone affect? So it affects your gross motor skills. So your tone is basically helps you initiate an activity. So if you've got a little bit of tension in the muscle, then when you want to move the joint, it's already halfway there. So if you've got lower tone, then you have to get yourself up to that halfway point and then do the activity. So it's almost double as hard to do the activity. And if you're less ready to be active because of this low tone, you're probably just not going to choose to do as much activity. And if you don't choose to do as much, then you're not getting stronger. So you're less likely to have that strength as you're just moving and developing. Rotation, so we had those two muscles there. If you try and rotate, so if you have to rotate, you kind of have to almost break up the muscle, and it makes it much, much harder if you've already got low tone and you're trying to make this really complicated shift between the two sets of muscles, where this one here is really short and that one's long, but over this side, this one's long and this one's short. They're doing really opposite things. So the muscle, the kind of the fibers are really having to work too hard when you have rotation. So children just decide not to rotate. It's very clever because they want to be able to move their bodies properly and as effectively as possible. But they choose not to rotate, and we need rotation. So by rotation, I mean my shoulders and my hips kind of over each other here. But if I move my shoulders and the hips, if you move your shoulders over like that, then that's rotation. And you can rotate by moving one leg, by crossing one arm over, all of this kind of stuff. Children with Down syndrome will try and avoid if they can. So things like, I don't know if any of your children are sitting yet, but do they do it by getting onto their tummies and then making their legs in splits and then kind of pushing themselves up like that, instead of doing the lie to sit, which is how it should be done, which is going over to one side and pushing up into sitting there. That uses loads of rotation. It's really hard for our kids, and so they'll avoid it if they can. Very clever, but not necessarily very helpful. You've got low tone, this is going to cause issues with balance because the two muscles aren't working so well. And all of this makes it more difficult to achieve their milestones. And then we have our fine motor skills, which are the kind of movement skills with our hands. So this kind of pincer grip, holding pens, doing buttons, doing zips, all that kind of stuff. Again, it's using both, all of this is two sets of muscles working together. And if you've got lower tone, if it's all a bit floppy, then it's just harder to be kind of more specific and get this really fine activity. Also, if our core is lower or isn't so good, then you haven't got a kind of a solid base to work off. So when you're trying to do things here, and if you're wobbling with your that's exaggerated, but you're wobbling with your core, then this is going to be much harder to work properly. Body awareness and sensory integration. If you've got low tone, which means that everything is a bit more floppy, then you don't feel the world quite as much as you could. So it can be that they don't have the same sensation. So it may be, I don't know if you've noticed any of the children who don't seem to have a pain threshold, or they're very tolerant to pain, or they will hit you thinking that they're just tapping you, but they don't quite know where their body is because they're not feeling it properly. We'll go over this later. And then communication. So you've got low tone in the rest of your body, then you can have low tone in your mouth. And again, your mouth uses loads and loads of muscles, especially your tongue, and to make sounds, you have to be really specific. So the two sets of muscles in your mouth that are trying to move have to work against each other really, really beautifully. And so low tone can affect communication. Concentration and attention. So if you are spending a lot of your time just trying to keep up against gravity, because you're having to work double as hard as anyone else, because you have to get yourself, you need to get yourself to initiate that activity, and then you need to hold yourself up. So you're having to use a lot more muscle strength than anyone else. Then it means that concentrating on stuff is just that much harder. It's just got too much that you're working on, basically. Behaviour. So as we said, every activity, action that our kids are having to make, they have to get to a certain level with effort and then do the action. So, that's really hard work, and all of us are inherently lazy. We all do things as efficiently as possible so we don't have to use energy. That's how we're made. It's a very clever way of being made, but it means for these children, they're having to use double the effort to do the same as anyone else would. So they're less likely to want to do it. So they're often termed as lazy, which is really unfair because actually they're having to work double as hard. Or they can be the passive child or bossy. So they can, what my brother used to do is to tell his 5 sisters what we needed to do to make life easier for him. And all of that is very understandable. We just need to get to a stage where they're so strong that they don't have to feel like it's double the effort. If they have an underlying strength, then that works the same as their tone, as if we're increasing their tone. So it's something that we can work with. But it's also worth noting that it's not a laziness thing. It is just more effort. And then the last one is sight and hearing. So a lot of children have glue ear. If they aren't paying attention, or you'll find it difficult to communicate with them, make sure that they are getting regular ear checks. It is common. And sight as well. There's a lot of children with Down syndrome don't have great vision. but also tone can change their vision. So if their tone is better, because it does go up and down through the day, if their tone is better, you could see that they're alert with their eyes. If they're kind of in that sofa position where they're even lower tone, you can kind of zone out a little bit with their eyes, because again, you've got two muscles doing every movement. So two muscles up here looking up and down, two muscles side to side, and so those aren't working quite as well. So if their tone is lower, that can kind of fade out. What affects tone? So during all of our days, we have different tone depending on what we're doing. So this is just generally everyone. So for me, I am sitting on the edge of my chair. I'm doing a presentation, so I'm alert and I'm having to think and react, and my tone is actually quite high. Whereas if you're sat in that sofa, maybe with a glass of wine, or maybe listening to some music, and it's late at night and you've had a tiring day and you're taken up that sofa and you kind of are flopping, then your tone will be going down. And this is the same with all of our children. So there will be times when their tone is higher and times when their tone is lower. And person to person, so some children will have much higher tone compared to other children. So things that affect tone, position. So if your child is lying down, I imagine they're probably more floppy than if you put them up against gravity. If they're in a supportive position, so if you're really cuddling them, they'll probably sink into you, whereas if you put them away, they'll have to be a little bit more alert in their bodies. Environment, so noises coming in can change their tone. So if it's really busy, suddenly they're more alert, whereas if it's just you in the room and you're you're busy doing something and there's no kind of external sounds coming in or sights coming in, then their tone can go down. Movement, so movement can be really alerting. So two things: either that you do the rocking and that can be really soothing and so the tone goes down, or if you're doing something like bouncing or spinning or swinging, that can make your tone better. So it's worth keeping in mind. Mood, so if you're content and happy, then tone can go down. If you're really angry or really excited, then tone can go up. The challenge of the task is a really big one. So if you are doing something that is really easy and you do it all the time, then probably your tone will go down. If you're bored, your tone will probably go down. If something is challenging, then you are more alert because you're having to think a bit more while you're doing things, and tone can go up. So we want to get a balance, because if things are too challenging, then you just give up and then tone will go down again. But so it needs to be just challenging enough to make you be able to be successful a bit, but it's still difficult, and then tone stays up. Illness, so illness can make tone go even further down. And touch, so if I was to give my child lots of support like that with nice big flat hands, they'd probably sink into it, it'd be lovely. Whereas if I'm poking fingers to try and keep my doll standing up, that would make you keep your tone in a better place. So these are all things that we can think about to try to help our children with their tone. So the second part of the physical side is hypermobility, which is basically flexible joints. So each of our joints is held together by ligaments, which are non-stretchy bits of tissue, and they kind of go around the joint and they hold the joint in place. Otherwise, the two bones would just pull apart. Our children, or children with hypermobility, those non-stretchy ligaments are a little bit stretchy or a little bit loose, which means that your children are just more likely to be able to move more in their joints. And if your joints aren't particularly stable, they're not holding on well enough, the thing that takes over is your muscles. So for example, your shoulders is a big example. Your shoulders is held together by some ligaments, but also loads of muscles coming over. So it's a flat joint actually, but your arm here comes into the socket here, and it's pretty flat. So there's nothing to hold it and to stop it going round apart from the ligaments. So if the ligaments are lax and your muscles aren't strong, then you're much more likely to get some kind of dislocation. So it's really important for those muscles to be really, really strong. So again, if you've got a child who's having to use double the amount of strength to be able to do an activity, but then also has to use their muscles to be able to stabilize their joints, then they're going to try and find a cheat. And the cheat is locking out joints. So if you can get to the end of the joint, then actually you're kind of hooking on the end of the joints and you can't really go anywhere. And that way, if you go fully at the end of the joints, you can switch off your muscles and then you don't have to do any work. Very clever, but it's not particularly useful for development. So typical things that you'd see is arching your back. So it's called lumbar lordosis. So you stick out your tummy, arch your back. Again, tummy completely switches off. I imagine a lot of you will have seen your children in that kind of position. The other one is knee hyperextension. So that's basically knees straightening, but almost straightening more than they need to. Hips, lots of turning out of hips, like that. That can just lock those hip joints. The neck's the big one. So this kind of position here, kind of pokey chin position, actually all you're doing is arching all your neck joints at the back and you're not having to do any work. Hyperextending elbows. So I've got hyperextending elbows, so it looks a bit like that. Fingers, so lots of kind of sitting with leaning on hands like that instead of hands like that, because then you've locked out your joints. Great, feel nice and stable. And then also there's flat feet. So if you've got loads and loads and loads of bones in your feet and all of them are held together with ligaments, if the ligaments are all lax, then you're probably going to get flat feet. And actually, in terms of hypermobility, probably 1 on 10 people in the world has hypermobility, and it's not much of an issue. And about 1 in 6 of the world's population also has flat feet, and it's not a big issue. The problem is that this is adding on to the low tone that they've got as well. So it does cause a little bit more of an issue with our kids. So children will find these compensations that work for them, which will make them feel more stable, which we all want to feel safe, and to try to do as little work as possible, so not doing rotation, that kind of thing. So it's these compensations that we want to be avoiding if we can. The other problem with going to the end of your joints all the time is that can cause arthritis when children are older. So we want to do what we can about that. So the specific kind of issues with hypermobility for our kids are an unstable neck, so the atlantoaxial instability. So this is right at the top of your neck. You have 2 joints that are kind of held together by ligaments. And not every child with Down syndrome has this at all, but it used to be something that was x-rayed for when children were younger, but now they realize there's no real point, because to cause a problem, a child would have to fall on their head to kind of dislocate the neck. So obviously it would be a terrible outcome, but you don't want any child landing on their head. So you would probably treat them just as you would treat any other child and try and prevent them falling on their head. The other one, as we said, was the lumbar hyperextension. So the lower back, locking out the lower back. And that, the more you do that, the less you use your tummy, which makes this core, which is already in difficulty because of how babies were when they were born, gets less strong. Instability of joints in your hands. If you're always locking out your joints, then you're not having to work the muscles. And if you're not getting stronger in your joints and you've got low tone, this can cause poor handwriting, poor fine motor skills. So the two kind of work together to make that stuff trickier. Hyperextending knees. So you can have hyperextending knees and do a beautiful stand and be standing and be very balanced there. But then if you start to walk, as soon as you unhyperextend these knees, the knees are going to be so unstable that actually bending these knees when you walk it's going to feel really wobbly. So they end up walking with kind of a quite bit of a waddling walking pattern, to try to keep those knees as straight as possible. And that means if you're not getting stronger in all these lovely small positions in your knee, these lovely bent positions, then things like steps, stairs, climbing, jumping, all these things that need a bent knee are going to be much more difficult when you're older. So this is what I was kind of talking about with the building blocks. If we can get these things better when they're small, before they're walking, then these higher level things will be easier when they're bigger. And then the flat feet. So as long as there's no structural problem, as long as it's not a stiff flat foot, if it's a mobile flat foot, which most of our children will have, then it's not a problem. Apart from the fact that if you're standing, you are having to make your feet work, you're having to make your knees work, you're having to make your hips work, your tummy work, your neck work. All of this needs to be working really well to get standing balance. So if you've got a really unstable base, if you've got really wobbly feet, it just makes it harder, just one more in the chain that's more difficult. So sometimes we put some stable shoes on, not because the flat feet themselves are a problem, but because it makes a more stable base for the rest to balance on. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So all of this stuff together, hypermobility and hypotonia, make four kind of things that we see often. So first is poor core stability, as we were saying, between the tummy and the back, the two not working brilliantly together. And the specific thing which is often missing is tummy strength, and a lack of rotation. So to have good core stability, you need the front and the back to be working equally. And so you need to be able to go forward and back like that, but you also need to rotate. And all of those together is your core stability. Poor shoulder stability. So again, if you're hypermobile, so that joint is not particularly stable, that can cause problems in this whole girdle. And if this isn't particularly stable, then it's going to be much harder for this to work. Pelvic stability, again, that's all this area here. If you're hypermobile and you've got low tone, then you're just going to be much more mobile here. And actually, the whole splits thing that our kids do is fine. That's their normal, and that's not a problem, as long as they have strength alongside it to make them stable. But many children will be really, really mobile and they don't have that stability. So we want to help them with that stability. And then generally is a lack of mid-range of motion control. So that's your end of range, that's your inner range, and all of this here is your mid-range. And that's what's missing, because they like to lock out their joints, because then life is easier and they're nice and stable. So all of this is harder, and that's through your joints. So that's your elbows, that's also in your tummy, like it's easy to be there, but it's harder to be there. And with your legs, knees, hips, all of that stuff. So we want to basically find things in the everyday life that can make those four things better. So the first thing is addressing when we were talking about the different things that influence your tone. So things like reducing their support. So actually, if you're doing sitting practice and you're all here helping them out and being really cuddly and lovely, then they'll just flop into you. Whereas if you reduce some of your support, they'll actually take over more. So it kind of feels a bit foreign, having to reduce your support when they're already a bit floppy. But it's one of those things that you try and just see, you know, in safety, so that if they fall, you're ready to catch them. But it maybe that helps their tone go up. You want to make sure that their activity is really interesting, so that they keep that tone up as well. Same thing, you want them to be challenged. You want to change the environment, maybe your voice. You know, if you've got a lovely soft monotone voice, actually that can start to make tone go down. Whereas if you start to do all this kind of stuff, that can keep their tone up. And changing their support as well. So you start on their shoulders and then you go down to their hips and then you're at the back and at the front. All of that will keep tone going up. changing their position, so from lying to side lying to sitting to standing, all of those different changes will keep tone in a better place. Or if children are up on their feet and their tone seems to go, so say in the classroom, if they're sitting at a table and it becomes obvious that they're zoning out of it, then it may be that they need movement breaks throughout the day to keep that tone up. The second really important one is to improve their underlying strength. So we want to prevent all these hyperextending compensations. So we want to work on rotation as much as possible. It's really hard for them, but they can get it. It's muscles, so they can get stronger. Muscles can always get stronger if you use it and if you practice. And then mid-range positions. So that kind of position. On your hands and knees, in sitting, rather than sitting like that. This kind of position is really lovely. And you want to keep strong throughout their range. So their range of movement is probably really big. But we want to use all of it and be strong in all of it. So not just strong here, we want to be strong all the way through there, all the way through there. So just general activity like swimming or gymnastics or ballet or football, these whole body exercises will keep them strong throughout their range of motion. And then we want to discourage unhelpful things. So if you've seen your children in a W sitting type thing like that, you see that? It's a great position for them because they've got a huge big base here and they feel really stable, and then their bodies are sat on top, legs not doing anything. You've stretched out all your joints even more than normal in W sitting, and their trunk isn't moving. So it's not a great position, not the end of the world, but if you can do a different position, that'd be better. So what can you do specifically? So we touched on that atlantoaxial instability. There was this thought that actually we want to keep children with Down syndrome less active just in case they land on their head, but the research has shown and the experience has shown that if you make children less active, they will have problems in all their body because they won't get the strength that they so desperately need. So we want children to stay active. We want to be doing as much regular activity as you would expect for any of your other children, but we just want to avoid, like any child, avoid them landing on their head. If they do land on their head, you want to be looking out for symptoms of cord compression. So if their neck has bent too much, then it could be that their spinal cord is compressed. So what you want to be looking out for is neck pain, restricted neck movement, so they can't move their neck like they normally would. If they're walking, which if they're able to fall on their head, it's probably because they're more active, so it's probably when they're up on their feet. So unsteadiness in walking, so if they were steady and then become unsteady, and deterioration of their bladder or bowel control. Something that's unusual. If they don't have bladder and bowel control, then you're not going to suddenly be concerned about that, but it's after they've fallen on their head if there's been a change. And if any of those happen, you go straight to A&E or ambulance, blue light it, because that's more severe. But it's not something to be anxious about or worried about. We just don't want them landing on their heads. Fingers and hands. So if this is where they want to be, if they hold a pen like that, that's lovely end of range activities. They're not having to use any of their muscles there because they hook everywhere. So we want the opposite. We want this kind of muscle control. So strengthening of fingers when all our fingers are a little bit bent. Fully bent does nothing. You're not really doing anything there. Fully open, you're not really helping there. So it's all this middle stuff. So things like putty, a fiddle toy, you could do things like in your Play-Doh, trying to take little bits of toys out of the Play-Doh, so hide things in there, hide marbles in there or little cars or something, and they have to take it out, so they're having to move the Play-Doh away. And you can, there's stuff called theraputty. It's quite expensive, but it's really great because it can be different levels of strengthening, or you can just try and find online. I'm sure there's a way online to make Play-Doh, which is a little bit tougher. But anything like that, those kind of small little exercises to get nice and strong. Squeezing a stress ball, that kind of thing. For their flat feet, you want to have some time when they're strengthening their feet. So there are Piedro shoes or other shoes that basically you want these shoes, so the two bones either side of your either side of your ankle, there are two bones, and you want the shoes or boots to come over those two bones, and then it stops that movement. So if you've got the foot supported up the sides and at the back, then it's just going to be a much more stable foot. I don't know if that makes sense. So we want them to go up here so that they can't wobble side to side, and they've got a nice flat bit underneath them. So it doesn't have to be Piedros, it's just Piedros are good if children's feet are too small for regular shoes. So they don't normally start these supportive shoes until children get a bit older. And they're great, as I was saying before, because if you stabilize the feet, then the rest of the body can get a little bit stronger. But it just means that your feet themselves aren't getting strong. So we do want your feet to be strong. So you want to work with shoes on and shoes off at different times. So I'm just going to go through a few different ideas depending on your child's age, just some basic positions that are good for them for this hypermobility and hypotonia. So we'll start with babies. As I said, babies like to be in that position, so we want them to be in a slightly more bent position, because if they're already there, they don't have to do so much work to be able to touch their toes, for example. So you can put them in rolled up towel. So you can either just have a kind of a hoop like this, or you can have a rolled towel that goes underneath their shoulders, underneath their head, and then their bottom drops down, it goes underneath their hips. And all of this just means that they're in that better mid position, so it's going to be easier for them to do the work. So from there, we really want them touching their toes. So because of this whole starting position out here, their backs is going to be stronger. All of this here is going to be stronger than all of this. So necks and tummies are going to be weaker than backs and backs of necks. So we want all this scrunched up stuff. We want to be in this kind of, it's called flexion, this kind of flex position. So in that cocoon, touching feet, even touching opposite feet, because that you're starting to introduce some rotation, which is lovely. And then on their tummy, if you just have them on their tummy like that, it's basically the same position as that, which we don't love, not really helping much. So on their tummy, you want them over a roll. So you want them over like that. And then they've got that flexion in here, and they're not completely out like that. That's really lovely to strengthen their heads. It's really lovely to start pushing up on their arms. It's a really beautiful position. And then the last one, because we're wanting to strengthen their front side here, is pulling to sit. I don't know if you can see me here. So if you're here, basically, if you think of gravity, gravity is pushing down from here. So if you're sat forward, gravity is going to want to push you that way, and you need to work your back muscles to keep you upright. Otherwise, you get pushed by gravity that way. If gravity is here and you lean backwards, you're having to use all your tummy muscles, your neck muscles to try to keep up. So the pull to sit activity is just brilliant for making neck strong and tummy strong. So if they're really small, you start like this, so you can have your hands over their shoulders like that. Thumb on their chest will help the chin go down, and then you can have a finger here waiting for the head to fall, and you just tilt backwards. And basically, you just keep doing this until they can hold themselves. So if they hold themselves there, then you hold that and you see if they can hold it. If they hold themselves there, then brilliant, you do it there. If they can only hold themselves there, that's absolutely fine, that's where you start. And you just basically work them in this kind of position until they can do it from this position, and then we pull up. But that's just a lovely, lovely exercise. And if your head is down here and they're looking at you and you're talking to them, etc., then they're keeping their chin tucked in as they go down, which makes that whole side nice and strong. So that's babies. So that's really important. Sitting. So sitting, the Germans, who are ahead of us with much stuff in pediatrics, they don't practice, no one practices sitting until they can get themselves up into sitting. So if you plonk a child in sitting, they will do their very best to stay there and to stabilize. They'll probably fix their legs, so straight legs flat on the floor, maybe with massive wide legs like that, to try to give themselves as much stability as possible. And then they're not going to do all the rotation and lovely movement because they're just trying so hard to stay still. Whereas if we wait until the child can lie to sit, then if they've managed to do that, their rotation is going to be brilliant. And if their rotation is brilliant, then their core is going to be pretty good. So then they're actually ready to be sitting, and then they can reach, and they're reaching forward, and they can reach up, and they've got all that kind of stability which to actually do it well. So I'd really encourage you not to just practice sitting. They'll either just flop completely down, or they'll start to learn to arch their backs too early, and that's not great. The other thing is, as we talked about these mid-range positions, your mid-range position, the very best position we can possibly get into is hands and knees, because that you've got bending, 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 everything's in the middle, nothing is out. It's all in lovely middly positions. And if you start sitting too early, the likelihood is you'll start bottom shuffling instead of rolling. So yeah, so wait for your sitting as long as you possibly can. Because crawling or hands and knees is brilliant, as soon as you start crawling, you are working pelvic stability, which is one of Down syndrome difficulties, core stability, because as soon as you lift one up here, it's like a table. Unless your core is working, that should just fall down. But because your core's working, you take this forward and your core stays up. And that's because, so that's making your core work really hard, and it's also getting rotation. So when one brings up like this to go forward, all your muscles, your rotation muscles are working really hard. You're also working your shoulder stability. And another little bonus is you're putting weight through your hands. And we get the strength in our hands by putting weight through your hands. And once you are off the floor, once you're walking, standing, etc., it's really hard to actually put weight through your arms. We don't do it naturally on a day-to-day basis, unless you're a climber or you're on monkey bars. We don't really put enough weight through our shoulders. So crawling, if we can get crawling, we are giving our children the absolute best chance for doing really well when they're older in their physical skills. So we want loads of tummy time as kids are young, as much as possible. We want to keep them off their bottom, off sitting until they can get there on their own. And we want as much hands and knees time as possible. So you can do hands and knees over your leg. So say this is my leg. So you can have them either with their knees down like that, or with their knees up like that, and you're putting loads of weight through their arms. And that will really help to encourage their hands and knees. If they stay still on their hands and knees, they can lock out their elbows. So if they lock out their elbows on their hands and knees, you want to slightly press in on the elbow like that, and that will just keep their elbows soft. And that means that they're still using their muscles rather than locking out their joints. So just keep an eye on their elbows when they're doing their hands and knees. So crawling, even better than crawling. So once they're on their hands and knees loads, and you've worked on hands and knees, and they're starting to lift one hand, and then they start to move forward, ask your physio for, if you are seeing a physio, for ideas of how to get them crawling. Like crawling is the absolute, I can't stress it enough, crawling is the go-to thing to do. Once they've done crawling, the way to go even better, cherry on top, is wheelbarrow walking. So you are the person here. You're holding them either by their ankles, which is really hard, their knees, or start them here, and they start walking around in their hands. And that is putting loads and loads of weight through their arms, through their shoulders. They're getting really lovely, lovely strong shoulders, and that will help. If their shoulders are stable, that will help with those fine motor skills when they're older. In standing, you want to keep their knees soft. So what they'll want to do is really push their knees back like that, snap their knees back, and then their muscles switch off. You can try it yourself. In standing, if you snap your knees back, you can wobble the front of your muscles aren't working at all. Whereas if you put a small little bend in there, tiny little bend, doesn't have to be big, the muscles start to work. So we want our children to be working those muscles as much as we possibly can from straight away, from as soon as they can stand. So the first thing is just slightly pressing at the back of their knee to unlock their knee. The second one is to have their foot up on a step. So if one foot is up, they are basically having to balance between two legs, but one of those legs is bent, which is lovely. Or you can be on a wobble cushion, which is basically a cushion filled with air. So if this is wobbling all the time, they can't snap their legs back because they'd fall over. They have to adjust to this wobbly surface. And all of those things will mean that your knees are getting, and your hips are getting stronger in all the tiny little movements that are needed for balance. It'll mean that they're going to balance much earlier, and then it means when they're walking that they can walk with a proper gait instead of a kind of a straight-legged, waddly kind of gait. Once they're on their feet, once they're walking, we want them to be challenged. It's always a bit of a challenge. We want them to be challenged so that they're again getting as strong as possible. So walking on uneven surfaces, so on grass, for example, on uneven pavement, on sand is brilliant, because all of that is challenging their mid-ranges. It's challenging all of this here instead of them being able to stay straight. And stairs and steps are your friend. So first of all, for crawling up them is brilliant, but then you want to be practicing stairs as much as possible because it's really, you need loads of strength and loads of stability. So it's brilliant for building up your muscles. On our Gympanzees website, we have loads of sections on different exercises you can do, which can help with all of this. So you probably want to look at core stability, there's leg coordination and balance pages, and then shoulder stability and strength pages. So have a look at them, they'll give you loads of examples of exercises you can do. Great. So sensory difficulties. So this is another section. So sensory difficulties, if you have loose joints, you're a bit more wobbly, then you may not have the same awareness of where your body is in space. It's a thing called proprioception. And if you are too lax, then the signals that go back up into the brain don't find it difficult to be specific as to where that body is. So I know very well where my hands are. I can copy them without having to look. So that's because my joints and my muscles are telling my brain as I move where I am. If you are more wobbly, then those messages just aren't going up quite the same. So it may mean that your child doesn't quite know where their body is, which makes things like, if you imagine stairs, not knowing where your body is to go downstairs, you'd have to really look at your feet and it'd be quite scary. So you'd probably want to hold on. So that can have quite a big impact on movement skills. And then also, as we were talking about, if tone is low, then you probably wouldn't feel sensations quite as much. And you potentially, your eyes and ears, your sight and hearing may kind of drop as tone goes up and down during the day. So we want to make sure that the sensory system is as good as it possibly can be. So you're not going to change what they feel, but if you give them more input, then they'll be able to feel it better. So things like big squeezes, big rubs, big compression of the joints, so pushing the joints into each other or pulling the joints apart. All of these things can give you a really big sensory input, which makes you go, ah, that's where I am. Things like a heavy rucksack or heavy work, carrying heavy things, things like a fiddle toy, and chewing, that kind of thing gives you a really good indication of where your body is. Again, we've done another talk on proprioception on our website, so have a look at that if you think your child has some sensory needs. And we've also done a sensory integration one, so a lot of children with Down syndrome have sensory issues, so you may want to have a look at those when you have the time, because they're really brilliant to help. So the last difficulty is the learning difficulties. So our children, again, will have varying degrees of learning difficulties. But for a child with Down syndrome, generally, it takes more time and more practice to secure a skill. So say it would take your average person 1,000 times to be able to get a skill completely automatic. It may take our children 1,500 times. So you just need to be practicing. The same thing over and over again. And it often becomes boring for us before it becomes boring for them. So you just need to keep going until they're getting that skill into their brain. Our children also, they can lose a skill if they're not practicing it. So most of us, that whole thing of if you've ridden a bike, then you can get back on a bike and you'll know how to do it 20 years later. For our children, they can lose things more than that. So it may be that they shoot forward with one skill. So this, we see that a lot, that their speech, for example, comes along loads, but then they completely forget how to do their handwriting skills because they were putting all their effort into the speech stuff. So we want to be making sure that the skills that they're learning, that they keep doing it. So with their physical skills, it's actually not so much of a problem, because generally our physical skills, we learn them and then we use them. So when you get core stability, that you then use it in everyday life. But it may be if they have a few months off doing their trampolining that they were doing really well at, or a few months off doing their horse riding, or whatever they were doing, they may have taken quite a big step back. So it's just worth keeping in mind. That's completely fine. That is how they are. So it's not something to worry about. It's not unusual. It's just something to keep in mind. They can have a lack of curiosity and interest in their surroundings. Some of this is due to so much effort going into having to regulate their bodies. So if when they were younger, they're trying to feel safe and secure in their bodies, and they're having to work that much harder than anyone else, that whole paying attention to what's going on around them, actually that can just be just one step too far. So that can be something to keep in mind. Children, learning needs to be tailored to their specific personalities. So as I said, there are some children who are super gutsy, and they don't care about hurting themselves, in which case we want to be really challenging physically with them. And others who are really visual learners, we want to do a lot of things with books rather than with activity. So it's about knowing your child. You'll know your child better than anyone else, and it may be this kind of information that you pass on to the school, as in how to get their curiosity and how to get their attention and their focus. A really big one is persistence with a task. So this actually is the case for lots of us, but we get really excited, and I know as a physio and as a sister to a brother with Downs, I get really excited with every little tiny brilliant thing that they do. So Jeremy would knock over some blocks, and he may have done it by mistake, just they were in the way, and he did that with his arm, and I'd be like, yay, he's knocked over some blocks, that's fantastic, well done. And that's brilliant, and we do it because it's natural, and we're so excited about our children meeting milestones or developing their skills. But if you keep doing this praise all the time for everything they're doing, they start going, well, I don't really have to do much and I get praise. And so it means they stop being so persistent in working hard, because they think, well, I'll get praise anyway, which is what we're all looking for. So I don't need to work hard at all. And then you stop the effort. So what we want to try and train ourselves to do, and it is hard, but it is doable, is to praise the effort. So so it's more saying, oh, you worked really hard, Jeremy, well done for, you know, for working hard to achieve this, rather than, oh, well done, you've achieved this. And so if you're praising the effort, they'll think, right, well, I need to put in effort to get that praise, and that will help with their persistence. Because if it's harder for them to learn, if they're having to repeat things more often, they need to be persistent. They need to be more persistent than other people. Our children have the same social understanding as anyone else. So they may have learning difficulties with some things, but they understand social cues, they understand how to wrap you around their finger, they understand how to make people do things for them. And so you really need to be treating them like you would treat any other child. And again, this is harder because you're like, oh, they're so cute. And you don't want to tell them off, or that kind of thing. But actually you're building a rod for your own back, because they will start to push the boundaries, and they'll just keep pushing and keep pushing because they've got the same social understanding as all of us. And if we don't have the right boundaries, we will just keep going and keep going. So it is really important to discipline like you would normally, obviously, lovingly, etc. But that is really important. And then they are visual learners. So they may do things like read differently. So instead of reading B-E-D, bed, they may just recognize the word bed. And that's how they learn it, rather than learning to break things up. So things like Makaton and PECs, so picture kind of representations of things around them, are both really useful. So Makaton actually has been shown to be useful in helping communication for all children with and without disabilities. But if you can do this with our children, they not only are hearing what you're saying, but they're seeing what you're doing. And if they can see, maybe that they learn or can understand more what's going on with your hands than they can understand what you're saying. And then that means that they are able to learn better, and then that in turn will help their own communication. So we're not saying Makaton is instead of speech, it's what you do on top of speech. And if you like a Makaton course as early as possible, I really highly recommend it for all parents, to be starting it at about 3-month-old, because if you start talking to them with your hands as well, they'll be learning both of them, and that is just one step forward for their communication. And like any children, they may stop one skill as they progress another. So they may have been really physical, and then they start their speech, and they stop their physical, and the speech goes up, and then they do their physical, and that's how we all learn, actually. So that's just fine. So tips on how to play or work with your child. So as we said, no indiscriminate praising. They need better persistence. So praise with the effort. Limit the complexity of the instructions. So it may be that they're only understanding the first thing you say. So if you say, go to the front door and put your coat on, they may only be able to remember put your coat on, and then they'll be a bit kind of lost, or they'll go to the front door and they don't know what's next. So start with one instruction at a time and limit the complexity, and don't add a load of stuff. Go to the front door, it's going to be a really lovely day, we're going to go and see Auntie Julia. By that point they've completely forgotten what they're supposed to be doing. So you start with everything, you start as simple as possible, and then as you find that they're understanding, as you're finding that they're learning, then you can add on more and more. But try to see what it's like just stepping back a bit. Learning needs to be self-directed. So they've done loads of experiments on the brain, and if you do a passive movement, as in you just move my arm, if you were to just move my arm like this and I was doing nothing about it, my brain doesn't even light up. I'm not learning a thing. If I start to do it, my brain lights up. If I have to do it and there's a maze that I have to get my arm around to bring it up, so I'm having to work something out, then my brain is like firing on all cylinders, and that's where you get the most learning. So you want them to be doing it for themselves as much as possible. You want them to be doing their active stuff rather than you helping them do everything. And you want them to work it out as well, rather than, sometimes it's frustrating because they're doing something slowly, but actually if you do it for them, you've lost all the learning. Whereas if you leave them a bit more time, it may be that you just help a little bit or give them something to think about. If they're going for a pen, maybe, oh, where is the pen? So they start to think, oh, where's the pen? Okay, that's where I'm going. You'll get better learning. Putting pressure on a child to catch up is not going to help anyone. They're not going to catch up, not in exactly the same way as other children, and that's going to be really disheartening. And that can be disheartening for you, for them, and it will cause both of you to give up. So they will do their thing in their own time, and it's worth just accepting that. They are children first, more than therapy or anything else. Their happiness and place within your family is more important. And every family has different restraints. If you're both working and there are lots of other children around, you're just not going to be able to do as much, and that's completely fine. They need to be happy and you need to be happy as a family, because that's going to really influence them a lot more than what input you're putting into them. And read their signs. If they are fed up, it may be that taking a break and then starting again in a few weeks' time actually means that you're more motivated, they're more motivated, and you get more out of it, rather than pushing, which it can be tempting just to work on something, but actually it may really not be the best thing for your child. So, in conclusion, your takeaways are mid-range activities, so anything with bending, basically, through all of this bit rather than out here. Core stability, shoulder stability, and pelvic stability, and crawling is king. And then as much rotation as possible. So it could just be in sitting, you give them everything to the side instead of giving them everything in front of them. Loads and loads of rotation. And then praise the effort, not the result. And that is it. Thank you very much for listening. The slides for this should be on the website as well, if you want to remind yourself of anything. And if you have any more questions, just send us a message. And take care. Thanks very much.